and she started shooting up heroin. And Tracy used dirty needles and contracted HIV. And at the age of 21, when I was in the 7th grade, she died. And it was devastating to our family. It tore the family apart.
All my children in the light, born in the city, the steady's trying to teach you right. My people, they see God in everything I write.
Well, welcome to another edition of On One with Angela Rye. I am your host, and today I have the great privilege of having with us Dr. Carl Hart. He is the chair of the Department of Psychology at Columbia University, and author of a new book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups. That might be backwards to y'all. We'll fix that on the other side. And I am really fascinated to have this conversation with you, Dr. Hart. I want to start with something I learned on a discussion from Oprah on Clubhouse. And she talked about how when she goes into interviewing with folks, she asks them to state their intention. And I want to do that today because this is a conversation that, frankly, I am a little uncomfortable having. So I think it's a perfect time to do just that, which is to state our intentions. So my intention for the interview today is to get a deeper understanding of your perspective. Understanding that some aspects of this may make me very uncomfortable, may make my listening audience very uncomfortable, and I would love to hear yours.
Thank you, Angela. I just have to correct first. I'm no longer the chair of psychology. I did my 3-year bid, and I'm on sabbatical now. But that's okay. I'm the most recent former chair, so that's cool. Yeah, my intention is to. My intention for doing this interview is to alleviate people's concerns and to help them to understand how they can enhance pleasure and their liberty. That's my goal.
And when you say enhance pleasure, you're talking about specifically as it relates to drug use, correct?
We're definitely going to talk about drug use because I'm a drug use expert. That's what I do. That's my science. But this is far bigger than drug use. If people think this is only about drug use, then they missed a large part of what the book is about. The subtitle is Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. That's what this is about, helping people to understand that they deserve to live their life like they choose to do so, as long as they don't prevent other people from doing the same, and that part of their responsibility as a citizen in a democracy is to fight for other people's liberty as well. That's what this is about.
So I know that your book isn't political in terms of Republican, Democrat, Green Party, Libertarian, but I'm interested in your political leanings because of the emphasis on liberty in your subtitle. Are you libertarian, or do you identify with libertarian kind of standpoints?
No, I'm not on anybody's football team. I don't get down like that. I'm an intellectual. And so wherever the evidence dictate my position to go, that's where I go. The positions that I'm espousing in the book are from the Declaration of Independence, the founding document of the country. And I advocate for us enjoying at least those 3 basic birthrights that they promise to all of us. That's it. That's American, not Democrat, not Republican, not Libertarian.
Yeah, and depending on how you read that thing, it may not have applied to us either, right? So depending on what you mean by us.
It certainly didn't apply to us. This is
Right.
what I'm trying to help people to understand. That's easy. We all know that. But Martin Luther King and all the people who we revered, they referred to that document in their fight for our liberty for a reason, because that's the promise. And you try and keep the country, you try and hold them up to their promise. You make them live up to that promise. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Got it. So let's jump in. And I know you're saying that if folks are focusing on the drug use portion and they've missed the premise of the book, I wonder how you feel about the amount of controversy that has really been stirred up around you basically confessing that you are a regular user of heroin, and you say that you were worried that you would get blackballed, blacklisted, and could potentially face, consequences from sharing this truth with people, right? That people would judge you in some kind of a way. How do you feel after sharing this and seeing how much attention has been placed on you saying, hey, I recreationally use this from time to time, this is how it's given me joy, or enhanced my happiness? There has been a lot of backlash. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, just to be clear, I wasn't really worried about the backlash when I wrote this. In the book, I explained that over the years, the past 30 years or however long it's been, I have been silent or in the closet about my drug use, in part because I was a coward. Yeah, being judged and that sort of stuff. But to be clear, I'm not concerned about what people think about that today. I'm an adult. I'm 54 years old. I take care of my family. I pay my taxes. I'm happy. So I don't really care what people think. But before, when I was immature, yeah, I worried about what people think. But those days are over. I'm good. Now, when we talk about the backlash, the thing that bothers me most about the backlash is that people don't understand where the backlash is coming from. The backlash comes primarily from like the New York Post, that tabloid that never really cared about Black people's liberation. And that's what this book is about, the liberation of those people who have been shut out. And so it breaks my heart when I get pigeonholed into some position that tries to ridicule me as being unhinged or whatever they've done, when in fact, what I'm trying to do is advocate for a compassionate position, for a loving position of people who have been shut out. And so that breaks my heart.
Mm-hmm. And when you say you're advocating for a loving position, what is that loving position that you're advocating for? When you think about the ways in which our communities have in fact been ravaged by drugs, by the selling of drugs, by the incarceration related to drug use, abuse, and sales, what is that loving position, Dr. Cross?
Yeah, so like you said, our communities have been ravaged by drugs. I began studying drugs 30 years ago because I believed that was the case. And that's not the case. And so that's why I wrote the book, to show people how they got hoodwinked. Like me, I got hoodwinked. I started studying drugs because I came up in Miami, and I came up in the hood, a resource poor community, predominantly Black. We were told that crack was destroying the community. So I went to the Air Force. I studied, got a PhD looking at neuroscience, trying to figure out how drug addiction was affecting the brain, figuring that I can fix the brain such that I would deal with this problem of drug addiction. Then after 30 years or so of study, I realized that drugs weren't the problem. The problems were the same old things that we already knew: lack of employment, racism, lack of education or poor education, lack of health care. All of these sorts of things were the same reasons, but drugs were convenient scapegoats. We can all point to somebody, for example, in our families who we saw as being addicted to a drug like crack or something else, and we can say, see, that's it. But as we look deeper, what I do in the book, you can see that many of these people's problems occurred before crack ever was even an invention. We certainly can see, like, for example, in 1982, the highest unemployment rates in the United States occurred in 1982. But yet crack didn't appear in most places until like late 1985. But crack was blamed for things like that. So crack was blamed for problems that were already there. That's one. And there were far more crack use in white communities than Black communities, but yet crack somehow destroyed the Black community. Yeah. And so these things just logically don't fit. And I pointed out in the book. And so I'm trying to help people to understand that it's not the drugs, It's these other things. And then when we think about our approach to dealing with drugs, what that means is that they're coming for you, your community. And that became a bigger problem than the drugs themselves. And that's what I'm trying to help people to understand.
Well, and I appreciate your perspective, but I do disagree. One of the things that you mentioned was we all can point to that one person in our family. I actually can point to two. And so I'm curious to know for you, and it wasn't crack, it was actually heroin. I'm curious to know from you if you have anyone who is a drug abuser in your family.
Of course. I mean,
Yeah.
we all do.
Well, and Dr. Carl, but hold on, like, just remember our intentions that we said at the beginning of this conversation. I think for us, in order to really be able to unpack this, we have to be able to have a peaceful, peaceable, and not so defensive conversation, right, to really get folks to hear, right? I don't want to trigger folks, and I know you probably don't either. So I know you said you do. Do you care to share the story of anybody in your family who abused drugs or was drug addicted?
Well, I write about it in a new book. You know,
I got through as much as I could. I've only had it for a day and a half, but I got through as much as I could. I plan to go to it.
It's cool. I mean, I write about it in the book. My cousins, friends, loved ones. So I write about this in the book, and I write about it in this book, the last book. This is where I spent 30 years studying, trying to solve the problem of drug addiction.
And when you see what happened with your friends that you mentioned, your cousins you mentioned, did their addiction have an impact on their immediate family?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
This is a concern. Obviously, this is a concern.
Of course.
But the thing about it is that they were having problems beforehand, and then
Before they began using drugs?
Yes, and
Mm-hmm.
and then once the drugs are gone, for example,
Mm-hmm.
they're still having problems.
Wow. Well, so, and I can appreciate that. I think that if you take a step back out of the research, which I'm sure is hard, that's been your life's work for 30 years, as you've stated, you know, when you have micro situations in families and immediate families where people have experienced heartbreak, heartache, potentially death and trauma because of drug addicted persons in their family, at some point that becomes a macro level community issue. So for my family, I have two. One is my cousin Tracy Looney, who died at 21 years old. She started using cocaine as a teenager, and then she began to use heroin, raised in a great family, two-parent household, my aunt and my uncle Steve, who is no longer with us, God bless his soul, but was around rich white kids, right? To your point that it doesn't just impact black families, it also impacts white families. And she started shooting up heroin, and Tracy used dirty needles and contracted HIV, and at the age of 21, when I was in the 7th grade, she died. And it was devastating to our family. It tore the family apart. And my uncle Tony, who is still with us and has been in and out of methadone programs, which you do reference in the book, is still alive. He started shooting up because he got glaucoma, a very serious case of glaucoma, at the age of 16 in high school. Thank you, Naja. And was told he couldn't play basketball anymore, and that was his life dream. And so that drug was an escape for him, and he was shooting up with my cousin, and that is what happened. And that also tore the family apart. And so what I would be loath to do is to say to people that drugs hasn't had the impact on you or your community that you think it has. What I would say is that my perspective may be a little bit different based on my research, based on whatever else, but to try to take into consideration that perhaps your experience, perhaps your research didn't take into account maybe a certain level of empathy, maybe a certain level of understanding that this did in fact ravage communities and tear families apart, understanding that it has been and provided gateways to other things like HIV/AIDS, the HIV/AIDS crisis in our communities. And of course, to your point, Dr. Carr, I get it. It is not just a it's not one single thing. Like, oppression shows up in all of these ways in classrooms, even at Columbia, right? Sure, we see it everywhere. But we shouldn't just completely discount the role that drugs have played in tearing up our communities.
You said a lot there, Angela.
I did.
And so I'm just trying to figure out where to respond, because, you described your cousin, and these are horrible things, and, I'm with you. And I acknowledge this sort of thing in the book. And I don't discount like people's suffering. This is a book that highlights their suffering and then give people an alternative, and gives us an alternative how to deal with these issues. And please forgive me for referring to your cousin's situation, but when you talk about the needles and the HIV, I talk about this in the book, about, for example, how the Swiss dealt with this issue in the 1990s when they saw large numbers of people in their communities contracting HIV from needles. And one of the things that they did was to implement these heroin treatment clinics, where they allowed people to come to a clinic twice a day, every day, to receive heroin injections, clean needles. Each of the person had a social worker, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, an internist. They all had housing. Now, 20 plus years later, they have, they work, most of them work. So these are the kind of things that I'm describing in the book, but the sort of national nonsense hysteria does not get to this sort of thing. And so,
I think that part of that is also unfair, because the hysteria sometimes isn't, and I'm not here to defend the US's response to drug use and abuse at all. But I think that what I'm saying is some of it's not hysteria, some of it is the byproduct of what addicted people do, right? Tracy had resources and the ability to get to needle exchange programs and all of that. But sometimes when you need a fix, you will do what you have to do to get the fix. And so, I know that this is about responsible drug use, but there are certain people, and I know you have also pushed back on the idea of addictive personalities or whatever, but there are certain people who don't always comply with responsible use. And so the idea that a group of human beings, right, Dr. Carl, to take a step back from drug use for a second, who will text and drive, who have to be manipulated, pushed and pulled to put a seatbelt on in the car, to wash their hands to prevent coronavirus, to put masks on to ensure that another person doesn't fill a hospital bed that's already overflowing. To think that like human beings, adults, would take the extra step to be responsible in something like this when they're not even responsible with who their pusher might be, who might be getting them the drugs. And maybe the argument here is that, well, if you can go buy them in the convenience store or the whatever, when the pharmaceuticals are also poisoning our bodies, it's just a whole other thing. So it's just, to me, it's like, no, adults still have the right to choose these things, to make bad decisions that could end up landing them in jail. Of course, the incarceration system is another podcast for another day. But ultimately, what we're asking for people is something they've demonstrated that they really don't have the responsibility and decision-making skills to do writ large.
So sticking with the example, your cousin Tracy, you were saying, she'd do whatever she had to do to get a fix. Now, one of the things that we do in this country is that we have stigmatized drug use so badly that people are pushed into the shadows, and then they engage in these risky behaviors that ultimately can lead to death in some cases, right? So again, staying with the Swiss example, they have taken away the stigma so people don't have to engage in those kind of risky behaviors where they end up getting in trouble. So they have taken this approach that looks at it from an objective, non-judgmental perspective to keep people alive to live another day. And again, these are the kind of things that I'm describing. I'm trying to help people to understand, take away the stigma, the judgment of those people, and try to help the folks who want to be helped or who can be helped. Obviously, some people don't want your help and won't be helped, and you can't do anything about it if they are adults. I get that, but all of these things I am sensitive to in the book. I am describing these things.
Do you at all get concerned with the thought that you're, like, I know you said that you're pushing for decriminalization of drug use, right, across the board?
No, you're not. I didn't say that. No, but we can talk about but please ask your question.
No, correct. Just go ahead and say, so your position is not decriminalization of drugs.
No.
What is your position?
It's in the subtitle. It's about liberty. People should have the right to put in their bodies what they choose to do so.
So instead of decriminal, so just, I understand the subtitle, and I definitely appreciate the push for people to get the book, to read the book, and all of that. What I'm saying is my position, based on what I thought I read in the book, and in some of the interviews that you have done, you have been on the side of decriminalizing. Is that it's not decriminalization, it's legalization, legalizing drugs across the board?
Legal regulation. And our
legal
job,
regulation.
And our job as public health, please don't put me in boxes. That's not right.
Putting you in a box. I'm saying it's a libertarian idea. It's not, I'm not calling you a libertarian. It is a libertarian idea. It is. It's fine.
No,
it is.
Hang on.
I'm right here.
It's the promise that is guaranteed in the founding document of the country. It's American. That's how I think of it. Because when I think of libertarians, libertarians sometimes don't think about safety nets. They don't think about those sorts of things. And I certainly believe in safety nets and helping folks. And so that's why it's a little uncomfortable to be put in that box.
Yeah, and I, again, for clarity, when I just said that, I was not calling you a libertarian. I was saying the ideology is libertarian. Central to libertarian ideology is liberty, which again is in the subtitle of your book. What I'm now getting clarity on is that your preference is for legalization of drug use, and not, so no, okay. Can you clarify that? Because I can't even get to the next part of the question. So can you just clarify that instead of fighting back on the libertarian box, which I'm not putting you in, and instead of referencing the subtitle, in a perfect world for you, drugs would be fill in the blank.
Legally regulated, not drug use. Drugs would be legally regulated, just like we legally regulate alcohol. Okay. We would have a quality control. We would control a unit dose. We would have requirements before you can purchase this, that sort of stuff. I lay this all out.
I understand. Dr. Hart, is it your understanding that alcohol is legal or not in this country?
Yes, legally regulated.
Exactly. Yes. So as I said, your position is that drug use would be legalized. Drugs would be legalized, correct?
Yes, okay.
Because you're asking for legal regulation. So that means that there would be no ban on illicit substances because they would not be illegal and illicit substances anymore, correct?
That's right.
Okay, so what I was gonna ask you was, do you at all get concerned about your position, particularly around heroin use, causing any issues for folks who have been fighting the fight of decriminalization for drug use over the last several decades? Are you at all concerned about becoming the poster child for why the GOP is like, we can't do this? Look, they just want to go and have fun with heroin, or they want to go and be on mushrooms, or they want to go and pop Molly. Are you concerned at all about taking away from that really hard, vigorous work over the last several decades?
So when you talk about taking away from work, I've been out there working. I've been one of the major people working. So it would be like taking away from my own work.
Exactly.
What I'm concerned about is keeping people safe first. So let me explain to you about decriminalization. Let's just think about the opioid crises. People are in fact dying. Yeah. And they are dying because for primarily two reasons when it comes to opioids. They're dying because they have tainted opioid drug. That is, they think they have something like heroin, when in fact they have something like fentanyl. So when you decriminalize drugs, it does not touch that. It does not enhance the safety of what people are getting. Legal regulation ensures quality control, and that's what I'm really concerned about, saving people's lives who are dying from tainted substances, from substances that the amount in their substance they don't understand or know, and so that decriminalization does not touch that. That's why I am worried about our focus on decriminalization, not really helping those people who are at risk to die.
Okay. And so the other thing is, in the book, you express some amount of frustration with people who talk about plant medicine, that people who utilize certain substances, specifically psychedelics for the most part, which you said you've only engaged in at lower doses. But your frustration was that there is a pass given or a certain amount of grace given to folks who will entertain those substances or use those substances for spiritual reasons. But if they see it in your lane, or they talk about it from your lane or vantage point, that there is not that same grace given. Talk a little bit about your frustration there.
Yeah, as you may know, I don't know if you know, Michael Pollan, for example, he's a writer. He wrote a book called How to Change Your Mind. He's a white, older guy, and he's talking about taking these substances, psilocybin, and a number of other sort of psychedelics. And his book and he were met with, they were welcomed in this space. We are excited about psychedelic drugs. And by that same token, we vilify other drugs and other drug users. And so my concern is that this becomes just another sort of way to exact American racism. So the psychedelic sort of proponents are largely middle-class white people who are separating themselves from other drug users and allow those other drug users to be continually vilified. And that's my concern. And we can see how this plays out. For example, Laquan McDonald was killed in Chicago, 16 shots. This poor young teenager he was shot by the police 16 times. And they tried to dismiss it as him being on PCP, which is a psychedelic. Ketamine and PCP are essentially the same drug, but our society looks at ketamine differently, more favorable, because it's associated with white folks' use, whereas PCP is not. Although the drugs produce nearly identical effects, the narrative around the two drugs are wildly different. We think of PCP as creating superhuman strength, which is not true. And police use that sort of narrative to excuse brutality and another number of bad behaviors in which they engage. And so I'm pointing out the proponents for psychedelics should be showing up and explaining that this drug, PCP, is nearly identical as ketamine, their drug, but they don't show up. And so I am lamenting that fact in the book.
You also reference folks who take psychedelics with shamans, and you mentioned that you find it creepy. Isn't that passing the same kind of judgment that you hope people don't pass while reading this book?
No,
It's not.
it well, it was more of a joke,
Oh.
and it's a joke when you read it in context. And
So here, let me read it in context. Some people find this comforting. I find it creepy and have never done so myself. For these reasons, I keep going. For these reasons, perhaps it's not fair to draw a comparison between my methamphetamine and my psychedelic experiences. Before this is where you talk about only using low doses of psychedelics.
So I'm sorry, your question is, am I judging them for that?
Yeah, isn't it passing the same type of judgment that you want people to not pass when hearing your perspective on
No,
drug
no,
legal
no,
regulation?
no, no, no. It's okay for them to have a guide. I didn't go into all the details of that. For example, when we have these guides, one of the major problems in the field today is that some of these guides sexually assault women. And that's one of the reasons that, I don't, I'm uncomfortable with that sort of thing. These folks having all this power, and then this person is vulnerable. So I don't understand what the concern is here. I mean, to each his own. But
Yeah, that was in reference here, but I definitely understand the sexual assault portion. But I also understand you referencing it as a joke. Well, Dr. Hart, I really appreciate you taking the time. Would love to know as we close what you really want people to get out of this book. And for someone who's a skeptic, some may be like me, and concerned about this, how would you convince them to pick up the book?
I don't know if I can. The goal is not to convince people who are skeptic. The goal is to get people to consider their own liberty. That's what this book is about, and to help people to understand how drugs and the scapegoating of drug further contributes to the subjugation of groups on the margins, Black people that I care about, like the community from which I care. So I hope people can consider their liberty and get past the moralism. Once they do that, then hopefully they'll be on the road to being free.
Yeah, I hope so too. I think the most important step here is to have these conversations with tenderness, empathy, and compassion, and understanding that everyone hasn't spent 30 years researching, and maybe some folks have, and perhaps they've reached different conclusions. But at the end of the day, none of us want our people incarcerated for drug use, abuse, or addiction. That's not a path to healing or to wholeness. And I pray that as we all go forward, we can do this in less defensive ways and understand that there have been a number of things that have ravaged our communities, including the tearing up of families because of drug abuse. And so I wish you safety as you pursue your liberty. But most of all, I wish you truth and love. Thank you for sharing this time with me today.